Hello and welcome to another motorcycling video. For context, I've just finished my morning run of 10 Ks. I'm not saying that to boast, I'm just letting you know what's going on. And I'm getting on my bike now and heading home. And I thought I'd take a bit of a ride around Goulburn first of all. I had a bit of a plan to go and test out another possible running route for another day. And so I'm recording the audio a couple of days later. And in this video, I'm going to be talking a bit about incomes and car prices. And I'm prompted to do this because I recently received my NRMA magazine. NRMA, for those who don't know, is the National Roads and Motorists Association. So it's the Auto Club version, New South Wales version of the Auto Club. And they have a magazine which I think they publish 4 times a year now, called The Open Road. And in that, they do car reviews, among other things. I'm interested in the car reviews. I'm not interested in some of the other stuff they do, but they do car reviews. And in this edition, I think they had a record something like 16 cars that they either reviewed by comparison or just as a standalone review. And for each car, of course, they've given you a couple of interesting figures, which were the price, which is not the drive-away price, it's the price plus on-road costs, and fuel consumption figure, which I think is an interesting figure, especially in the light of what's happening at the moment. So what I'm talking about when I say what's happening at the moment is this is March of 2026, and people would be aware that there is conflict in the Middle East, which is having an impact on fuel supply and fuel prices. And in fact, in an earlier video, I suggested it might be time for people to start thinking about EVs as an alternative, especially if you are a person who lives in the city and most of the driving you do is in the city. But in any case, in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about incomes and motor vehicle prices as reported in the NRMA magazine. So my first question, I'll start with a question then, is to say to you, how much are you prepared to spend on a new car? And I suppose your answer will depend on a couple of things. And the first question you might ask me is, or the first consideration you might have is, well, what sort of car am I buying? Am I buying a hatch, a little hatch for my teenage child who's just got their license? Am I buying a replacement family vehicle, which might be a 5 or 7-seater? Am I buying a medium-sized sedan, like a Toyota Camry, for example? Am I buying a dual cab 4x4 ute or something like that? So I guess it depends on what sort of vehicle you're buying in the first instance, and then secondly, how much you earn, so that you can determine how much you are prepared to pay or able to pay or are willing to pay for the vehicle that you're going to buy. I'm asking these questions because I'm trying to find out what was the median price that was paid for a new vehicle in Australia. Now, according to figures that I found for September 2023, which I realised 2.5 years ago, the median price for a small car was $26,454. The median price for a medium-sized car, which is $36,075, and for SUVs, the median price was $39,857. According to newer figures I saw in February 2024, the average cost of a new car in Australia was $61,949. Now, I realise average and median are not exactly the same thing, but that seems to be an enormous jump between those, even for SUVs at nearly $40,000 to $61,000 or $62,000. So I guess a lot depends on, first of all, what car am I buying? What sort of car am I buying? What am I buying? What's the use of it going to be? How many people have got to transport and so on? And how much can I afford to pay, or how much am I willing to pay? Now, in all the conversation I'm going to have from here on, I'm not suggesting there's anything untoward about the prices that are being asked for these particular vehicles, and neither am I recommending or trying to sell you one, and have no connection to any company that makes, imports or sells vehicles. I'm just talking about motor vehicle prices because, as I say, I read this article in the NRMA magazine, and they compared lots of cars, and I thought it was a conversation, would make an interesting topic for a video. So if we accept that the average cost of a new car in Australia in February 2024, which is 2 years ago, was $61,949, let's call it $62,000. That seems like an awful lot of money. Now, according to the Bureau of Statistics, the average annual salary in 2025 was between $90,000, I beg your pardon. The range was between $91,000 and the lowest average annual salary in Tasmania, I believe, and $113,000 in the ACT. So based on that, it's 2 years, a bit over 2 years' salary for you to buy an average price car at $62,000. A different measure says that the median annual salary in Australia is $88,400. There are, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, 2.6 million people who are on the minimum wage, which if you work full-time would be $46,000 a year. So at $46,000 a year, it's going to take you a fairly decent amount of time to be able to afford a $62,000 car. 27.5% of Australians apparently earn over $100,000 per year. There are 14.68 million people in the Australian workforce, meaning that 12 million or more of those people are on something other than the minimum wage. So incomes apparently are reasonable. I suppose you're listening to me now and thinking, well, I don't earn that money, or the bloke next door to me, he must be making a lot of money because I don't earn that amount of money. But so I'm thinking, okay, the kind of car that I buy depends, first of all, on what is the purpose of the car. Is it, as I say, for my teenager to get around? Is it for the family to get around in? Is it a second car for someone to do the school run, gym run, all that sort of stuff? Is it a tradies ute or something like that? So that's your first question. I guess this next question that comes from that is to say, well, how much can I afford to pay, or how much am I willing to pay? I think a little earlier I said that it was going to take you quite a while to buy a $62,000 car if your income range was somewhere between $90,000 and $113,000. In fact, that's about 2/3 to half a year's salary, or just over 2/3 to just over half a year's salary. So, but on the $46,000 salary, it's a year and a half salary. All right, so let's get to these figures from the NRMA about the cars that they talked about. But before I do that, according to another bit of information I found somewhere, I think it might have, in doing this research, average new car prices in Australia. If you were buying a Ford, the average price of a new Ford, across the entire range of vehicles in the Ford lineup, is $62,000. For Toyota, it's $55,000. For Mazda, it's $47,000. For Hyundai, it's $44,000. And for Kia, it's $41,000. Now, those 5 manufacturers are among the top 10. The other manufacturers would be mostly Chinese manufacturers, but those 5 are among the top 10 best-selling brands in Australia. So we're looking at somewhere between $62,000 at the most expensive and $41,000 at the least expensive. Now, in this NRMA magazine, they compared 3 vehicles. Those 3 vehicles were the Toyota Corolla, I think it's a CR, it might be GR, the VW Golf, and the Hyundai i30N. Now, those 3 vehicles, for comparison purposes, the Toyota Corolla GR is $67,990. The VW Golf is $58,990, and the Hyundai i30N is $52,000. Those are 3 medium-sized hatches, a very popular segment in the market. When you consider the Toyota Corolla, they have sold something like, I believe, worldwide 20 million Toyota Corollas, and at one point you would have it would have been a reasonable thing to assume that the Toyota Corolla was the Japanese equivalent of the VW Beetle. It was a cheap car that every person could afford. Volkswagen, well, stands for Folks Vehicle. Volks is the German word for folk. So Volkswagen was the people's car, and the VW Beetle was the epitome of that. The Toyota Corolla was the Japanese equivalent of that at one stage, but here is one that is $68,000 plus on-road costs. As I say, the other two in that comparison were the VW Golf, which is $59,000 plus on-road costs, and the Hyundai i30N, which is $52,000. Now, things to consider with those three vehicles, as well as price, were the average fuel consumption that was returned during the test period of that vehicle. For the Toyota Corolla, it was 8.4 litres per 100 kilometres. For the VW Golf, it was 7.2 litres per 100 kilometres. And for the Hyundai i30, it was 8.5 litres per 100 kilometres. Now, when you buy a car, I imagine that there are lots of considerations for everybody: safety, the original purchase cost, the repayment cost, the insurance, the registration. But I imagine fuel economy is a consideration. Now, you might argue, well, if you're buying the Toyota CR or GR, I'm not sure if it's CR or GR, I can't remember, it's a turbocharged 1.6 sports version or racing version of the Toyota Corolla, you're probably not buying it for fuel economy. But at $68,000, I imagine, yes, you probably aren't buying that car for fuel economy. But since when did hatch vehicles become so expensive that the cheapest of them at $52,000 is considered to be a bargain? Now, within the range of vehicles that were mentioned in this NRMA magazine, as I say, there were 16 cars that I either tested as a standalone car or in some sort of comparison test. The prices ranged from $32,990 for the Kia K4 sedan, which returns 6.6 litres per 100 kilometres, as I said, $32,990, all the way through to the Hyundai Palisade Calligraphy Hybrid, which returns 6.8 litres per 100 kilometres and costs $89,990, or let's call it $90,000 plus on-road costs, which I imagine are another $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. So you're looking at $95,000 or something. Now, as I said at the beginning of this, or earlier in this broadcast or in this video, I'm not suggesting there's anything untoward about what any of those prices. I'm simply saying that they do seem to be awfully expensive. If we're in a cost of living crisis, as we're being told almost daily in the news, in the media, then cars that cost $90,000 and cars that cost $67,000 seem to be at the upper end of, whilst they're not at the upper end of what's available on the market, they're certainly, in my view, at the upper end of what's considered to be an expensive car. So the question I posed at the beginning of what would you pay for a new car? In my case, I have a Toyota Corolla Camry, which I bought. It's a 2010 model, which I bought which was bought new in 2011. I think it was actually bought as a demonstrator. It had about 100 kilometres on it, and from memory, we paid about $36,000 for that. And that was drive-away cost. Now, I think that the current version of the Toyota Camry, the mid-spec one, is about $42,000. So I suppose a $6,000 price increase over 15 or 16 years probably isn't terribly exorbitant. And if I were buying another car, I would be looking at something, I'd be looking at something somewhere between maybe $35,000 and $50,000 that would be the top of my budget. Now, I'm a retired person on a superannuation pension, and so obviously my income is a factor, but also my transportation needs are a factor. At the time we bought the Camry, we were probably transporting 2 adults and maybe three children. We aren't transporting any children anymore. There are 2 adults and a dog. So we would probably look again at a Toyota Camry, or maybe even the Corolla Hybrid, I'm not sure that whilst in an ideal world we would buy an EV, I'm not sure in the practical world we're ready for that just yet. Occasionally we make trips to Melbourne and occasionally trips to Brisbane, and then even more occasionally we make trips to Tasmania. So the constant stopping to recharge and so on would add extra hours to our trips, which also would be irregular. And it's not like a daily occurrence or a weekly or monthly occurrence. It does become a factor you have to consider. And if you're thinking, for example, of driving to Brisbane, it's about 11 hours driving, even with just fuel stops, 5-minute refuel and a short stop to eat. If you have to add 20, 30 or 40 minutes or more waiting time, recharging time, it tends to be not an 11-hour drive, it could turn out to be a 13 or 14-hour drive. So that would be a consideration. In amongst those vehicles that ranged, as I said, from $32,990 all the way through to $89,990, there were a collection of utes, including the Toyota Hilux Turbo Diesel, the Toyota Hilux Double Cab, the Kia Tasman X line. There were a couple of Chinese EVs or plug-in hybrids, for example, the JQ J5 EV with a range of 402 kilometres, which costs $35,990. And by the way, as I said, I'm not recommending any brand or anything like that. I'm just telling you the prices that were quoted and details that were quoted in the NRMA magazine. They didn't give you an energy efficiency for the JQ, but it said it had a range of 402 kilometres. That's WLTP, so obviously our real-world driving is going to be reduced. There was the GAC Ion 5, which is a full EV, which uses 16.7 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres and costs $42,590. I'm thinking with that its range is probably somewhere in the 400 or so kilometres. And then there was the Chery Tiggo 9 Super Hybrid, which costs $59,990 or $60,000 plus on-road costs. It's a super hybrid, so it returns 1.46 litres of fuel used per 100 kilometres. Obviously, when you're driving it in EV mode, and I believe you can get something like 100 and something kilometres in EV mode. After that, its fuel consumption is probably going to be 6, 7, maybe 8 litres per 100 kilometres. There are two other EVs that were mentioned in in those reviews. That was the Polestar 2, which costs $62,400 and uses 14.9 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres, and the Kia EV4, which returns the same energy efficiency, 14.9 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres, but costs slightly more at $64,690. So the point I'm making here is that there is a range of vehicles on the Australian market, from starting at $32,990 for the Kia sedan all the way through in this review to the Hyundai Palisade Calligraphy Hybrid, which costs $90,000. And based on average annual earnings, we're looking at close to a year's salary for some people, more than a year's salary for some people, and in some cases 2/3 to a half a year's salary to stump up the cash to buy a new car. So, when you're considering your car purchase, you're going to be looking at what's the vehicle I want to buy? What do I want? How many people am I transporting? How often am I doing it? Do I need a 3-seater, a 5-seater, a 7-seater, something like that? Do I need an SUV? Do I need a 4x4 ute? Those sort of considerations. How much is the drive-away price? Based on what it is that I can haggle the dealer with, and in some cases there is no haggling anymore. The price is the price is the price. And then there are, what are the repayments, what is the insurance, what's the registration, and a cost not to be dismissed is the cost of fuel. And whilst the situation in the Middle East may be considered for some people a temporary situation, it does highlight the vulnerability we have in terms of fuel security and the possibility that any other time that there's an outbreak of hostilities of any sort, be it in the Middle East or anywhere else for that matter, Australia is certainly vulnerable in terms of fuel supply, and that vulnerability will translate itself very quickly into rising fuel costs. Well, those are my thoughts. They're sort of rambling around among incomes and fuel prices and so on. If you have a comment, leave it in the appropriate section and I'll respond when I become aware of it. Thanks for watching. Have a safe day wherever you're driving, whether it's a car or a motorcycle, and I'll talk to you again when I'm making the next video, whenever that might be.